Hello. I'm glad that you've joined us for our final session as we continue with the lessons that David has learned on his road to become King of Israel. When we pick up in a series later on, we'll see him as he is finally king and realize that just like us, life lessons are never completely and finally learned. But today we're learning how David strengthened himself in God. Last week, David had been with the king of Gath, Achish, and he had spent over a year there in the land of the Philistines, living a life of comfort, a life of deceit, and he had made a name for himself among the Philistines. As they were going out to battle against the Israelites, King Achish said, "Oh, David, you're my favorite man. I want you to be one of my top leaders." Well, the other princes didn't like that, and they sent David home, back to his home in Ziklag, where he had been for the past 16 months. David, he's now rejected by the Israelites and dejected by the Philistines. He's lost all. He takes off back home for a 3-day journey, he and his 600 men with him. They arrive in their hometown of Ziklag. Over the past 16 months, they've been working very hard, going out on raids, building a kingdom for themselves. They've become wealthy, comfortable. They left their wives and their homes there to go out and deceive the Philistines once again. But when they get home, they realize a tragedy has occurred. While David had gone out during this time, he had told the Philistines, "Oh, I am going to the land of Judah. I'm going to be killing people there, destroying and burning their towns." And all the while, he was fighting against the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites were the people that Saul should have destroyed when he first became king. And that's part of the reason that he lost the kingdom. They probably heard all that David had been telling Achish, the king of Gath, and they said, "We're going to get even." And so they came through Judah, where David had claimed to have been fighting all these past months, and came straight up to Ziklag. They burned Ziklag to the ground, and they took David's wife, 2 wives, all the wives of all and families of everyone else, all their possessions. No one was harmed, but David and his men didn't realize that when they arrived. When they got there and saw everything, they were heartbroken. They were filled with despair. There was absolutely nothing they could do. They were just devastated. As a matter of fact, 1 Samuel chapter 30 and verse 4 says, "They wept until they had no more strength to weep." Can you imagine crying that hard? I'm sure some of you during these past 16 months, as that time has been for David, have gone through some things that have made you hurt. And you have shed tears until you think, "I just can't cry anymore. There's nothing left in me. I have no more strength." David saw his family gone, everything that he'd worked for gone. And here he thought that he had found a place of comfort and relative safety. And he realized in just a moment, everything could be lost. What a lesson for David and for us. Any time that we place our trust and our hope upon things that we build, upon plans that we make, especially when the foundation is deception, as David's was, it can so easily and very, very quickly fall away. All that he had was now reduced to rubble. And For all he knew, the Philistines had taken his wives, and they could have killed them along the way. They could have abused them, or even something worse. The lies and the compromise of the past 16 months are catching up with David. Verse 6 says, David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the souls of all the people were grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. David's men, for some reason, blamed him. Perhaps they thought, David, if we had not listened to your foolish idea of leaving the wives here, of leaving our children here unprotected, while we went off to fight against Israel's enemies, none of this would have happened. It's your fault. They blamed him. Everybody blamed him. And just when he believed that all was lost, except for his mighty men whom he could depend upon, even they joined with the others who picked up stones and were getting ready to stone him. David had never been in such a place in his life. He had no one to turn to now. Jonathan, his dear friend, was gone. Saul, who had chased him down and tried to kill him, was fighting his own battle far away. Even his family he had left in the country of Moab. And here his family, his wives, had been taken, and they were captive. And those friends, those mighty men who had been with him for years now, had turned against him. And David himself had really turned his back on God. He had forgotten him. He had left him out of the equation. He had lived a life of deception and compromise for the past year or so. And in doing that, he lost his place with God. Only it wasn't lost forever. And that's the hope that we have. When we drift away from God, as David did, and that's really what happened, it was a gradual thing with David. It was a little snip of Saul's robe here, a little taking of the spear there, a little bit of calling out Abner, a little bit of taking bad advice from a friend and running away. It was just one thing built upon another thing, nothing big, we could say, but put it all together, it became large and caused David to get farther and farther and farther away from God. And there he was, all alone, without friends, without family, and without God. You think, wow, what an end to the story. Well, as Paul Harvey used to say, let's hear the rest of the story. Because the rest of verse 6 says, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. When things were so bad, when things seemed like they were impossible and David should have given up hope, David starts to remember God's faithfulness. Nothing changed the situation. The situation still looked hopeless, but David, the word says, strengthened himself in the Lord. Now, strengthen here is the same verb that's used by Moses and used by God when they told Joshua to strengthen himself in the Lord. It speaks of tremendous moral or physical strength in the face of impossible situations. When Moses spoke to Joshua in Deuteronomy 31, 6 and 7, he said, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you, and he will never leave you nor forsake you. I mean, this verb here, this strengthen, this is the same word when Samson, that judge who lost his eyesight, who was a captive of the Philistines, who had turned away from God, came back to God. And in the moments before he died, he prayed out to God and he says, give me strength, God, to push these pillars and to destroy this temple. It's a powerful word that caused David not just to be strengthened, but to be encouraged. He encouraged himself. How did he do that? Well, what was it? A special song? Maybe it was a prayer. He wrote a lot of the Psalms, so maybe he wrote out a prayer. Or maybe it was a positive confession. Yeah, we like that. Exactly how David did it, we don't know because the Bible doesn't say. All we know is that he did encourage himself. And I'd say it probably and possibly was a combination of all of those. He probably looked back on time and he remembered how God had helped him as a young boy out there watching his father's sheep to kill that lion and the bear. And then as a youth, he came up against that giant who was nearly 10 foot tall. And with that sling and that stone, he killed Goliath. Maybe he remembered how he had been innocently playing the harp. And God helped him to dodge the javelin that was sent out from Saul. Maybe he remembered how God had helped him when, as a young captain in Saul's army, he went out against the Philistines and he came back into town hearing Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. All of this started to rise up within him. He remembered the time when he'd been out on the mountain and he'd been in the cave. And it was hopeless because Saul was surrounding him on that mountain. His army was coming from both directions and he was caught in the middle. But God sent a messenger right at that moment, calling Saul and his army back to Israel. He started to remember those things, and he remembered that God had delivered him each and every time, and that God had given him 600 trustworthy men. Even though they might not be real happy with him at the time and things didn't look too good with him, God had given them to him and they were still there. Since most of us are takers and not givers, it might be hard to understand how one person could encourage himself when we look to others to encourage us. But that's exactly what David did. He encouraged himself. He strengthened himself in the Lord. He knew where his help was. David says, I'll look into the hills from whence cometh my help. He knew that his help didn't come from man. He knew his help didn't come from the circumstance. He knew his help could only come from the Lord his God. And that is where he strengthened himself. He encouraged himself. And then what did he do? Well, verses 7 and 8 says, Then, after David had encouraged himself, he said to Abiathar the priest, please bring the ephod to me. You see, sometimes we start praying right in the midst of things, but sometimes we need to encourage ourselves and think about God's goodness before we start asking for the answer. David didn't bother to ask why. He didn't say, what should I do next, while he was in the deepest despair. No, he started to look at the greatness of God. And once he saw who God was, he was then able to go out and say, God, I know who you are. And now, because of who you are, will you tell me what I am to do? He got things in right order. He knew he was not able to do the what until he knew the who. And we can't go out in our own strength, because that's what David would have done if he had taken off for those Amalekites as soon as he got to town. It would have been in his strength. But David realized, God, I know who you are, and because I know who you are, I can trust you to give me the right direction that I need. And so he inquired of the Lord, and he asked, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And God answered him. God is faithful. God will answer you every time you come to him in prayer. And God said, yes, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail shall recover all. Don't be afraid. Stand firm in the deliverance that the Lord will bring you today. The Lord will fight for you just like he did for David. You only need to be still. You need to be still and see what God will do for you. Let him know. When David went through this final test during this phase of his journey before he becomes king, things started to move very fast. David had returned to himself. He knew who God was, and he knew who God had called him to be. David knew that he was the anointed, he was the chosen, he was the called. And if you're listening to me, and if you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, you can know the same about you. You are God's chosen, you are his anointed, and you are his called. And just like David faced the most impossible situation and the most heartbreaking circumstance of his life, you can go through those as well, knowing that God will be with you, that God will help you. David returned to himself, and he had renewed hope in God. He sought God in prayer, asking him for guidance and instruction. And God answered. God said, pursue, because you will overtake them. He said, go after those Amalekites. And he reassured David that he and his men would win the victory, that they would be the overcomers. And in verses 9 through 19, we read about how David did that. The first thing he did, David went, he and his 600 men. Think about that. You're one person. You've got 600 men ready to stone you. 600 angry men. 600 men who are men of war, and they know how to kill because you've taught them. They know how to take advantage of a situation and get rid of the enemy because that's what you've trained them to do. They're all against you. But David says, wait a minute. I've got the word of the Lord. And they saw something. They had to have seen something in David's face. They had to have heard something in his expression that gave them hope, that gave them courage. And that's one of the things. When God speaks to us, when he gives us a word, when he gives us the hope that we need, it's not just for us, but it's so that we can share it with others, so we can speak life into those who are dejected, rejected, those who are heartbroken. He wants us to be able to speak those words of life into them. And the Bible says that David took those 600 men, and he went out, and he recovered all. It says none of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had taken from them. David recovered all. When David had encouraged himself, when David had strengthened himself, he was then ready to move out. He was ready to move with his little army of soldiers, just as though he were a king with a great army behind him. No, he wasn't a king yet. He didn't wear the crown. But he didn't need the title or the crown, because at this point, God was doing something in his heart. He had strengthened himself, And God knew he was ready to move into the next step for his destiny. He demonstrated there in the rubble of Ziklag, where he had learned to encourage himself in the Lord, where he had learned to strengthen himself, that he was ready to move on, that he was ready, finally, to be the next king of Israel. And that's where we're going to start the next series in a few weeks. And that's where we're going to pick up as we see David, as he assumes that position of kingship. David faced and overcame many tests in the lessons that he had to learn on his way to fulfill his destiny as king. And he learned, though, never to give up, never to give in. It didn't matter if it was Saul, those Ziphites, or Ziklag. They were only tests. And David encouraged and strengthened himself so that he was able to pass every one of those tests. In the next series, as we see David as king, though, we're going to learn that he had more lessons to learn. Lessons that were even harder. Lessons that took him even deeper into despair. But he never forgot. He never turned his back on God again. He always knew God was his source, the one he could turn to for strength. And that's what I want to leave you with as we conclude this series on David. That you can know, no matter what you're going through, God is your source of strength. He will give you hope. He will give you help. And you will come out a victor.